Let me ask you something most people get completely wrong about submarine warfare. They think the deadliest submarines in history were the ones from World War II, the U-boats hunting convoys in great Atlantic storms, or American submarines gutting Japan's merchant fleet in the Pacific. And those campaigns were devastating. But the single deadliest submarine ever put to sea, the one holding a record that has never been broken by any vessel in either World War, wasn't hunting in the 1940s at all. It was hunting 2 decades earlier, and almost nobody outside naval history circles has ever heard its name. That submarine was U-35, and by the time its war ended, it had sunk 194 ships. Nearly 500,000 tons of shipping sent to the bottom by a single vessel. To put that in perspective, that's more ships than the most successful American submarine of the entire Second World War managed to sink in 5 separate combat patrols, combined many times over. And this record wasn't set by a fleet. It was set by one boat under one commander. In a war, most people remember for trenches and machine guns, not underwater warfare. Here's why this story matters, and why it's been buried under the more famous legends of World War II. When people picture submarine warfare, they picture the Battle of the Atlantic Wolfpacks, sonar, depth charges, the desperate convoy escorts of 1941 through 1943. That's the version that ended up in movies and documentaries, but the doctrine, the tactics, and the sheer devastating potential of submarine commerce warfare were actually proven a generation earlier. In waters most people never think to look. So here's where this video is going. First, we'll look at the man behind U-35's record, and why his approach to submarine warfare was radically different from what came before him. Then, we'll break down exactly how a single vessel managed to sink nearly 200 ships without being sunk itself. We'll examine the ethical firestorm this kind of warfare created, because sinking merchant ships wasn't just a tactical choice. It came with consequences the world is still grappling with. We'll look at why this record has survived, untouched, for over a century. And by the end, you'll understand why one obscure World War I submarine commander did more to define modern naval warfare than almost any admiral history remembers. The first thing you need to understand is the man in command. Lothar von Arnaud de la Perrière took command of U-35 in the Mediterranean in 1915. And what set him apart wasn't recklessness, it was precision. According to several sources, de la Perrière developed a reputation for extraordinarily disciplined methodical hunting, surfacing to use his deck gun, and conserve his limited torpedoes whenever possible, rather than firing expensive torpedoes at every target. This wasn't about drama. It was about efficiency, about treating each patrol as a calculated campaign rather than a series of isolated attacks. And that discipline, more than any technological advantage, is what allowed him to rack up sinkings at a pace no other submarine commander in either World War would ever match. Here's where it gets dangerous for the merchant crews on the receiving end of this strategy. The Mediterranean in 1915 and 1916 was a hunting ground unlike anything defenders had prepared for. Allied convoy escort systems, the coordinated defenses that would later make the Atlantic so brutally costly for German U-boats in World War II, simply didn't exist yet in any mature form. Merchant ships sailed largely unaware that a single submarine could methodically work through a shipping lane for months. Picking off vessel after vessel with almost no organized resistance, U-35 wasn't just a well-commanded boat. It was operating in the one window of naval history where the defense hadn't caught up to the threat yet. And that combination of skill and unprepared opposition is exactly what produced a record that's never been equaled since. This is the counterintuitive turn worth sitting with, because it wasn't superior technology that made U-35 unstoppable. The submarine itself, by later standards, was primitive, limited torpedoes. No sonar as we'd recognize it today, no coordinated command network. What made U-35 devastating was the same thing that made it possible for the Allies to eventually close that gap. Submarine warfare was, in 1915, a genuinely new kind of threat. And new threats are always most effective in the years before anyone has built a defense against them. Let's talk about the human and ethical cost of this record, because it's the part that gets skipped over when people just quote the tonnage numbers. Unrestricted submarine warfare, the doctrine that allowed commanders like de la Perriere to sink merchant vessels without warning, became one of the most controversial aspects of the entire war. It's part of what eventually drew the United States into the conflict. After the sinking of passenger and merchant vessels killed civilians alongside sailors, a submarine hunting merchant shipping wasn't fighting a purely military target. It was attacking the supply lines that fed entire nations. And every ship sent to the bottom carried crews who had no real way to fight back against an enemy. They often never even saw before the torpedo hit. Here's the moment that matters for understanding why this record still stands. World War II produced far more submarines, far more patrols, and far more total tonnage sunk across entire fleets. German U-boats alone sank a staggering amount of Allied shipping over the course of the war. But that tonnage was spread across dozens of boats and hundreds of patrols, fighting against convoy systems, sonar, air patrols, and coordinated escort tactics that simply didn't exist when U-35 was hunting. Ever came close to matching one boat's tally from a war fought 2 decades earlier? The record didn't survive because nobody tried to beat it. It survived because the conditions that made it possible, an undefended hunting ground and a genuinely novel form of warfare, never happened again. Why does this matter now, in an era of nuclear submarines, drone warfare, and satellite tracking? Because it's a reminder that the deadliest weapon in any war usually isn't the most advanced one. It's the one that exploits a gap nobody has closed yet. Every branch of modern military strategy, from cyber warfare to autonomous weapons, follows the same pattern U-35 established in the Mediterranean over 100 years ago: find the defense that hasn't been built yet and exploit it before anyone catches up. The word to carry with you here is unmatched, not glorified, not celebrated, simply unmatched. 100 years to world wars and thousands of submarine patrols later. Nobody has come close to what one boat and one commander achieved in a stretch of water most people couldn't find on a map. That's the truth behind this record, and it's a truth that says less about one submarine's power and more about how briefly and how completely an unprepared world can be caught off guard. So, here's a question worth sitting with. If the deadliest submarine record in history was set by exploiting a gap in naval defenses that no longer exists, what does that tell you about the weapon systems today's militaries are quietly worried they haven't prepared for yet? Tell me in the comments what you think the next U-35 moment looks like in modern warfare.